St. Francis Yacht Club in San Francisco. This is the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, hosted by Ron Young.
Welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon. It's fun to be back in our grill room again, looking out these beautiful windows. Where else can you see a race at the same time as you listen to a thoughtful speaker? So many of us who've been around the Yacht Club for a while remember the sporting green. Years and years and years ago, there was a sporting green in San Francisco, and there was a yachting columnist named Jack Smalley. And he wrote in a kind of Hemingway-esque style with lots of colorful language about, gritting your teeth as you went up the weather side of San Francisco's North Shore. And he would make people smile and grimace as he described the craziness of sailing. Well, while he was writing all that stuff, our speaker was born. And from 66 to 70, he learned to sail at Tulane, University of Tulane. Also brought our staff Commodore Terry Andolini to us. So this is a good place to get future Commodores. And then in 7 years after that, he became a member of our yacht club. And 4 years after that, he wrote a book called Sailing the Bay. He wrote a book called Sailing the Bay. It was a very cool book and a thoughtful, informative book. Those of us who read it at the time and who'd been sailing on the bay for a couple of decades thought this is a pretty savvy assessment from a guy who just got on the scene. He would go on. That was an early indication of his brightness. He would write for the Chronicle from 79 to 73, doing more than Jack Smalley did, because our writer for the Chronicle was actually a racing sailor. So Kimball knows how to sail. He's raced on the bay many times and for years. He even sailed a youngster to a victory in a Wednesday night series. And so he's also aware of the sailing world, having written for every major magazine around the world in that context. And some years ago, it occurred to him that what a cool thing it would be to sail in the milestone editions of the Transpac, that is to say, the Centennial Transpac, and the Bermuda race, the Newport to Bermuda Centennial race, and the 100th sailing of the Chicago Mac, all of which he sailed, which was, first of all, hip to be aware of it, and then to go off and do it. He then also wrote our 75th anniversary book. Took him a year to write it and a year to edit it. That's no small feat. It's a great book. Not every yacht club has a 75th anniversary book, and thanks to Kimball, we have a very, very good 75th anniversary book. And then he ascended to the role of Commodore in 2016. And all this time, we all knew that he would sooner or later be our historian. He had all the credentials and the skill set to do so. And when the previous historian found his way over the horizon, we asked Kimball to be not only historian, but the curator for several years. So he did double duty. And then, ever a glutton for volunteer punishment, as many of us are, he then took on this junior committee. And it's very rare that a staff Commodore would become the committee chair of an active committee. And the junior committee is not just active, it has everything to do with the future of our club. So to hear all about the past of our club, I can't find anybody more authoritative than our speaker, Kimball Livingston. Kimball.
Thank you, Ron. To get started, I want to recognize that we have a rather special sailor with us today, the man who won this year's single-handed Transpac, Jim Quancy. Give us a wave, Jim. And
didn't you sail on the Buffalo when you were younger?
Thank you for the invitation. As a matter of fact, I can give you some history, because when Clarence Nelson owned the Green Buffalo, I sailed on it quite a bit, and it's the first boat I ever sailed on the Pacific Ocean. On top of that, there was a Sausalito Tuesday night, which coincided, or it was, the very first date of my future wife and me. She's sitting over here. She's made it about 38 years now. And she split the pencil skirt that I failed to tell her she shouldn't wear. but she's forgotten all about that. Our topic today is rather unusual because over the transom, out of the blue, came this guy from the California Pioneers of Santa Clara. Hi, I'm Rick Helen, and I'm a film buff, and I have found a lot of old footage shot by one of your Commodores, and I've digitized it, cleaned it up, edited it, and I want to give it to you. Oh, this doesn't happen every day. So let me give it some context before we get to the video. Hart Weaver should have been our third Commodore. He was one of the three men who were high activists in creating a city club at a time when the San Francisco Yacht Club was going to move out of Sausalito. Do we know where that hum is coming from? Okay, well, there was motivation to get out of Sausalito. Let's reach back to 1869. The San Francisco Yacht Club was formed in Mission Bay. Nice weather down there, but by the late 1870s, that was being filled in by the railroads. It was being industrialized. They escaped. They went to Sausalito to a building on Bridgeway that we know as two restaurants, the Ondine and the Trident. For the next 50 years, that was the San Francisco Yacht Club. It worked very well, which gives me an opportunity to call up my friend Jim Patrick, who has something that he wants to share with the St. Francis Yacht Club. Come on up, Jim.
Thank you very much. I have to say, my wife was digging through things, and she found out, what is this? This is a 1904 San Francisco Yacht Club, all about the companies and the people who were involved. And my grandfather had this, and he was a member of the Yacht Club at that point in time, and he was part of the group that moved over and formed the St. Francis Yacht Club. And I have some copies which you can look at that, and I'd like to make a donation of making this part of the club's history, because it goes back to 1904. So won't you please accept this?
Thank you, Jim.
You're welcome.
I haven't seen this yet, but I do look forward. We share DNA with the San Francisco Yacht Club, obviously. Now, why did they need to get out of Sausalito? Kind of the same deal that had happened to them in Mission Bay. It was where the railroads met the ferries, sometimes as many as 5 ferries in an hour at peak traffic. It was smoky, it was rocky, and there were people living, a lot of people living now in Marin County. When we roll the video, you'll see that in the late 1920s, about 1930, there are a lot of houses on the Belvedere Hill. Not so much in Tiburon, but a lot of people living over there, and there was interest in Belvedere Cove, which became available for sale. What a delightful environment to place a yacht club. You're in the lee of Belvedere. They could get underwater rights. That meant they could have a marina that would generate revenue, something this club wishes we had. So it made a lot of sense to go to Belvedere Cove. And the people who were in charge, Clifford Smith, John Piver, they were the leadership at that point, wanted to go to Belvedere Cove, but there was a different faction in the club. Now, I don't want to shock you, it was a yacht club, and there were factions, and, just grow up, it happened. But there was a reason, on top of the desire to bring a yacht club back to San Francisco, where there had not been one for 50 years. And that was that Belvedere Lagoon, even when it was dredged, was never going to be deep enough for the biggest boats in the club. Now, there were people in the conversation who said, well, let's have a station on each side of the bay. I mean, that's so obvious. That's the way to do it. Oh, I don't know. It's going to cost a lot of money. would it really be sustainable? And we like Belvedere. So it came down to a rival slate in the election of 1927, and between Hart Weaver and Clifford Smith, no, it was Piver who was going to be Commodore again. He had been Commodore for 2 years, gave it over to Clifford Smith, was coming back as Commodore, so he won the election, 108 to 72. That triggered a lot of things, and when you dig into it deep, which I can't do from a lectern here, there were a lot of concerns like, well, if the dredging doesn't go well, who's on the hook for the money? Things like that. And basically, some people left the San Francisco Yacht Club, formed St. Francis Yacht Club very soon after. And they were not just anybody. John Punnett, who became our first Commodore, had twice been Commodore of the San Francisco Yacht Club. Jack Johnson, who was in line to be our second Commodore, was the son of then-Senator, former Governor Hiram Johnson. We know him as Jack Johnson, but he was really Hiram Johnson, Jr. And then there was Hart Weaver, son of a very successful auto dealer. They were doing Studebakers, and Weaver had more than one yacht because that's just the way things were done in those days. The election was in January. The incorporation of this club was in May. And only 4 months later, the first piles were driven. The idea was, we have only a 10-year lease. And this deserves some color because all along, the people driving for a city location had known that they could get a lease somewhere on the yacht harbor. It was state land. Jack Johnson, well, his daddy had good friends in Sacramento, and they could figure out how to get this thing done. But John Piver, Clifford Smith, John Piver was head of the search committee, was adamant that you had to buy the land, and he wouldn't budge. And in the big meeting that really got down to the nub, and I, when I was working on the 75-year book, had the good fortune, because Jill Jordan did not throw away all of Denny Jordan's pack rat stuff, the stenographer's record of the meeting in which the good gentleman debated the merits back and forth. And Piver gabbled it down. It can't be done in the yacht harbor. Bang. That was the signal for our guys to come over here. Jack Johnson did exactly what he had known he would do. He went up to Sacramento, talked to his dad's friends, got a 10-year lease, which was the longest lease that a state could give. So they built the club on pilings, thinking, well, if we have to, we can barge it away. There are images around up in the dining room. You can see a photo of the club on its pilings, and we'll have a view of that today, too. It wasn't until the 1930s that they started filling in underneath. And I know that some of you are used to me being up here and never looking at notes. This is to keep me on track. So, yeah, we're done with page 1. But this is where my notes cue me to offer an opinion about something. I think it's a real pity that the club split, meaning the San Francisco Yacht Club. The fact that this club survived and that club survived suggests to me that a club with 2 stations would have survived. Ponder for a moment how powerful that would be right now. But we can't fix it. They're not going to join our club, and we're not going to join their club, so this is where we are. But that's an opinion I don't hear people offering very often. It certainly is my perspective. And while I'm on my horse, I'm going to point out that beginning in about 1967, by mutual agreement, we instituted an annual affair, a match race affair, between the 2 clubs, the San Francisco Cup, for the sake of promoting camaraderie, amity, good relations between the 2 clubs. I have watched that fail consistently. It is not doing its job. I believe the San Francisco Cup should be utterly destroyed. And I say that in every meeting of the staff Commodores. So we'll move on from that, but I might run out of opinions soon. So they had a yacht club. Leon de Fremery wrote up the bylaws. He mostly copied the New York Yacht Club bylaws because he liked the fact that they had a bifurcated leadership, a chairman of the board and a Commodore. The Commodore didn't have to be all things. That's a much better arrangement. I'm so grateful for it. I was Commodore in 2016. Robin Driscoll was chairman of the board. I would have been a lousy chairman of the board, and he was brilliant. The main thing I did as Commodore was respond to Robin when he sat down and said, I've been doing projections, and if we don't institute capital dues, we're going to be in trouble somewhere down the road. And I looked at his numbers, pretending I understood them, and said, okay, on my watch, we're going to institute capital dues. Fast forward to 2020, Paul Caillard is chairman of the board. This club has money in the bank. It can make decisions. Paul says, Kimball, thank you so much. So as a Commodore, you have opportunities to make a difference. No Commodore wants to be on record as having raised the dues. But when there's a reason for it, you do what you have to do. I do not envy this board right now. They're having to raise every price under this roof. It's not anything anybody wants to do, but I don't think they have any choice. Wilfred Page designed our Burgee. He simply rearranged the triangles and the stars, came out with a pretty nice looking Burgee, I believe. I don't know whether that was a lack of imagination on Wilfred's part, or perhaps wishful thinking that maybe the clubs would get back together soon, but that's our Burgee, and it's not going away. The present board is planning to convert the wardroom into a game room. A little shuffleboard, a pool table, and there's precedent for that. When the guys built the original 1927 clubhouse, they had a squash court, they had other stuff, and they talked about having a tennis court, and then realized that, wait a minute, a club on pilings probably isn't going to be a very good place for a tennis court. So there never was that. But they also experienced, while they were a club on pilings, before we began to fill in under the club, in the storms in the winter, water would come shooting up between the floorboards, and if this was a storm in the winter, you might have wet socks right now. So they filled it in, and everybody let that happen. The design was basically a napkin sketch by Jack Johnson, given to the Willis Polk firm, and then executed architecturally by Austin Moore, who was also a member of this club. Those were kind of special times. One of the arguments for bringing the club here was that the Board of Supervisors was increasing its budget and throwing money at the yacht harbor in order to make it a better place for a club. They want us to come here. They're giving us a better place to come. They want us. Let's go. So there was a dredging contract to take care of the harbor out here. It went to the leading civil engineer of the day, our first Commodore, John Punnett. I'm not sure that we would get away with that today, but Punnett got the contract. Who was John Punnett? He was a Brit who had a job as a civil engineer in England, and he stayed with that until the president of the company, the owner of the company, put his squirt of a son over John Punnett. Punnett took off for Australia, stayed there until there was a family emergency back home in England, passed through San Francisco, came back here as soon as he could, and never left. Very strong civil engineering background there, and an important player in the city of his day. How different were the times? Another example before we get to the video. Walter Fletcher was the manager of the St. Francis Hospital. And because the food was so good at the St. Francis Hospital, they hired him to be the manager here. Yes, got to chew on that for a while. But it worked. Fletcher was a very important player, stayed with the club for about 15 years. He was responsible for a lot of the infill out there. He also brought with him a young Filipino named Serviana Fernandez, who stayed with the club for 39 years. He became an institution, Mr. Fernandez. You might be able to think of a similar example today. But moving quickly, the club was incorporated in May of 1927. In December of 1928, it was ready to open. Can you imagine that happening today? So on that night of the grand opening, there was, of course, a celebration. Mr. Fernandez was on the scene, and he recalled it was a really nice party with all the trimmings. One of the bartenders had passed out before it even started. Let's see, I may be through these notes and ready to get this thing going here. And if I'm not, it's a good enough time anyway. So, Rick Helen, California Pioneers of Santa Clara, it's a big job that he did and gifted to us.
Around the year 2000, a building contractor discovered a box of vintage family films while demolishing a house in Santa Cruz, California. Well, naturally, he brought them home and preserved them from being destroyed. Ultimately, in 2023, they were donated to the Film Restoration Program of the California Pioneers of Santa Clara County.
Some of this I kept just because I liked it's so colorful.
The films were cleaned up, digitized, and with a little research, they discovered each of the 16 reels were taken between 1929 and 1930, all by the same person, Hart Weaver, age 39 at the time, and living in San Francisco, California. Hart's father, Chester Weaver, was the owner of the city's Studebaker dealership, located at the city's famous corner of Bush and Van Ness.
Centennial Yacht Club had been founded in 1886 and then built up from that lower level. Now, I know that the golfers in the audience would want a little more golf footage than I left in, but now we're going upriver. That is Jack Johnson's yacht Kima, 92 feet. He brought that around from the East Coast with Senator Johnson aboard. Lou Cantel told me that he used to be up there as a kid, maybe 20, 30 kids at a time, and a lot of the parents would go home on the weekends, but there was always a mom for the kids. For dinner. I'm a little bit of an aviation nut, so forgive me, I kept a little something in here. It's not average. The Gertrude, also known as Gertie, this was a time when the R class, boats about 32, 30 feet long under the universal rule, were very popular on San Francisco Bay. Arthur Rousseau had an R boat because he had to, but Artie Rousseau had at the time 6 yachts. The smallest was 36 feet, the biggest was 92, it's just how things were done. Neustaedter was not himself an R-class sailor. He was sort of the godfather of the fleet. This was his yacht. He loved following the races. He gave out prizes. He had parties aboard the boat. He was the mothership for both Lady Gay and Ace. Roberta Neustadt. When I knew her, had a house on Seacliff Avenue, and at 95, she was still driving her flaming red Jaguar. I don't think she made 96, but it looked like a pretty good run. And no, I'm going to leave some things out. Let's keep going. That is Newt. Properly attired. So the clubhouse went up rather quickly. Remember, it was opened in 1928. Built on pilings, and they were used to the amenity of stopping in front of their clubhouse in Sausalito. Remember now the Andine Trident building. They could pull up in deep water and load on, offload, whatever they wanted. They wanted the same amenity here, so they put a pier out in front of the St. Francis Yacht Club and discovered that the city front was really not a place to just kind of pull up and park. So that feature of the club did not last very long. You see a lot of similarity to the club that is here now, but not one stick of that is still here. In the background, you see the area that held the squash court. Well, you don't anymore, but the squash court, there were garages. One of our Commodores kept a number of high-performance cars in his garage. Others were used as maintenance shops. All of this would be about 1930. This was the yacht of the moment, the favored yacht of the man who should have been our third Commodore, Hart Weaver. It was designed by John Alden, built by Stone. This would have been while Stone was in the East Bay, the logical place to go. These things all tie together by and by. This is a model of the Marilen, which Lester Stone, as a builder, wound up finishing because in the Depression, Hart Weaver suicided. And watching his home movies of his family gives me an extra sense of the tragedy of that suicide. John Punnett served for 2 years, 27, 28. Jack Johnson served as Commodore 29 and 30, while simultaneously serving as chairman of the board. So for a while, that bifurcation of responsibility didn't really matter. But it was in 1930, spring of 1930, Hart Weaver resigned from the club. Obviously, Studebakers weren't selling. He wasn't going to ever be Commodore after all. But it was 2 years before he suicided. We don't have anyone in the family to tell us what may have gone on around that. But the Marilen became part of the ongoing story of St. Francis Yacht Club. It was owned by a succession of Commodores, including Tom Short and Jenny Jordan. In the 1955 Transpac, which is in this photograph over here that most of you are too far away to really make out, and we're about to split and talk about the bird boat Cuckoo. We think that was probably owned by Weaver, and that's why he featured it. Cuckoo is still with us. It's owned by Bill Clausen. It won its division in the Master Mariners race this year. I'm going to go back, 1955. Jenny Jordan owned the Marilen, this yacht, entered it in the Transpac. But he didn't win. That race, the 1955 Transpac, went to a boat called Morning Star and a man whose name you ought to recognize, Richard Ream. Ream had set a Transpac course record in 1949 with his boat rigged as a schooner, came back with a yawl-rigged boat, the same Morning Star in 55, and brought home that wood canoe over there in honor of his achievement. Shifting back to the home movies over here, my eye is drawn to the club itself, the architecture of it. Remember, Jack Johnson sort of sketched that out, handed it to the Willis Polk firm. Austin Moore, our member, turned it into something architectural, and it was built quite rapidly. But it never had much of a foundation, which is probably why the part that didn't burn in 76 fell down in 89. And this home movie aspect here I do find fascinating. The two little boys, one's the big kid, one's the little kid. And everybody seems quite amused at the relationship between the two. Mom is laughing. Dad's behind the camera. But I wonder if we saw this in 2023, would it go on without intervention? It's Too bad I never met these guys as adults to say, well, what was that like? The bird on San Francisco Bay, just like the R, it was a very important class. Bird was built for sailing on San Francisco Bay. It was a local design, finished off back east. And here we are on an opening day. I'm pretty sure we arrive at footage that makes it necessarily an opening day. Again, many houses on Belvedere. Now we're on Okay, that was Tiburon in the background. We're going to be heading over to the San Francisco city front pretty soon. A parade down the city front on opening day. Our first opening day as a club, the boats rallied off the construction site, sailed with the Corinthian fleet, and then went to Corinthian Yacht Club for a dance between the two clubs. I almost missed it, but toward the left there's a bump in the saddle. That looks to me to be 2500 Steiner Street, about halfway up to the penthouse. They were still building. And every fiber of my being wants to yell, "Weaver, slow down." Okay, we're back to the river. And the reason I kept this footage in, to me, this tells me a lot about yachting attire and the attitudes of, well, gender relations, how things went on. I'm pretty sure that as the lady descends on the other side of this, you're going to see that she's wearing not high stiletto heels, but heels. At least it's not a pencil skirt. She's had practice. Maybe I should emulate that look. I'll have to consult Mrs. Livingston. How else would you dress to go up the river? Now, we're showing this here, but understand that this is online and available to you anytime you sign into the St. Francis Yacht Club website. Bob Hanelt has been a hero for the club. He's populated our collection management system, which is museum quality. A lot of the smaller museums use exactly what we have. And for the last 2 years, 3 years, really, he's been assiduously populating that with documenting the models that we own, which ones are on loan, where the trophies are. If I move a trophy from one room to another, I report to Hanelt. He keeps it up to date. And if you were to sign in to the St. Francis Yacht Club website, look across the top where it says Archives, click on Archives, go down to Collections, open Collections, click on Search, enter Weaver. It will take you to 6 videos edited already by our friend Rick Helen and given to us for our use. Any old time, you can go there. There's a lot more than this. And Ron, I see you taking notes, but I think we ought to go over here. It's time.
Great, Kimball. Thanks for bringing us all that history. It's fun to look back at the colorful beginnings of our yacht club. How much did it cost to build the first club, this clubhouse, when it was first done in 28?
I wish you'd told me you were going to ask that.
Kimball, I count on you. You know all about the yacht club. I didn't think I'd brief any of the questions with you earlier. What do you think it cost to have a movie camera like that? Here's Hart Weaver shooting movies in the 20s when Hollywood is, just being born. Any sense about that?
I can't put a dollar figure on it, but only a very rich man could possibly have chosen to do that. He was using the best professional equipment. He even has some that he shot. We don't have it, but he even worked in color in 1929, 1930. And it was a very inaccessible technology at the time and very pricey.
So when the breakaways come over here and start St. Francis, how many founding members are there, or were there?
325 on opening night.
And was there an initiation of those members? Did they have to pay initiation dues or fees?
It was organized so that the very first members made a $300 loan to the club. This at a time when Mayor Rolfe was being paid $500 a month. So a $300 loan to the club, which in many instances later, when we got to a point where we could burn the mortgage, a lot of people forgave the loan. It was a very common thing, and of course a nice gesture and made you look good. So that was the first group of people, $300, and it was a loan, and then they reached a certain threshold, I believe it was 100 members, and they cut off that deal, and it was a $500 initiation fee from then on, until, of course, they raised it.
So San Francisco Yacht Club basically breaks in half, and members come over here. What's the first name of those members? When did they first surface the St. Francis name? Because I remember a name being used before that. Are you familiar with any name being used by the breakaways before they announced St. Francis' name?
Not officially.
Danny Jordan told me that they were called the 49ers for a while.
Well.
They were called the 49ers when they first came. That wasn't official because they hadn't essentially announced it. But then when they announced St. Francis, there was consternation from our Sausalito, then Belvedere friends. What do you know?
Probably. It wasn't actually 49 people who broke away. That's just a handy number. And yeah, I'm aware they did. Some people called them the 49ers. It was a handy tag.
It was named after the San Francisco Gold Rush, 49er craze, sure. And all of that stuff.
I thought it was after the football team.
So back in, when I sailed with Jim Michael on Baruna as a teenager, he was advancing the idea that we buy Kyle Cove. Talk to us a little bit about, and you mentioned thoughtfully the notion that both yacht clubs could exist right now. What do you know about that initiative? Because it was $1 million in 1960 or something. It's currently worth maybe $1 billion. But what do you know about that kind of initiative?
Well, many things have been discussed in terms of a future for St. Francis Yacht Club. Our lease has 32 years to run. We certainly want to get a new lease negotiated before we get anywhere near 32 years. And we don't know what the atmosphere of the city will be a few years down the road. To put some color on that, our lease, as secured by Jack Johnson, was 10 years, the longest that the state could allow. And in the 1930s, it occurred to the guys that, we don't want to be on a 10-year cycle of renewal. It would be so much better to have the state transfer the title to the city of San Francisco, and then we can just deal with our friends down at City Hall. Well, that was done. Jack Johnson, the way I like to tell the story, got into his Packard, drove up to Sacramento, and talked to his daddy's buddies, and the state gave the land to the city and county of San Francisco, along with all the Marina Green. This city forgets that St. Francis brought to San Francisco the marina green. We sit on a tiny piece of what we brought to the city. It's rarely discussed in glowing terms at the Board of Supervisors, but it is a fact.
So one of the fascinating aspects of your talk is that we get to see this affluent family making movies, for heaven's sakes, of themselves and cruising about, and then you've added the tragedy element of Hart Weaver killing himself. How did he kill himself?
We don't know any family members. There's one surviving somewhere who recently lost her husband. The person who knows what I just said declined to connect me to her, and all I know about Hart Weaver beyond what I've said so far is that he is interred in Colma in that big mortuary. I think the Catholic place, Lord's, what's the name of it? The cemetery.
Holy Cross.
Yeah, Holy Cross. I have a mother-in-law and a father-in-law there. Just don't remember the name.
So you mentioned the San Francisco Cup. So in the early 60s, I was sailing on Amarita when Bill Stewart of our club brought up a matching Cal 32 from Southern California on delay. And in the effort to have harmony between our two clubs, they initiated what you referred to as the San Francisco Cup. And it continued in a spirit of rivalry for all those years, since those years to now. And you have rightfully noted that there's not quite as much harmony as the deed of that regatta would, hope. What could be done to improve the camaraderie between the two clubs?
Blow it up. It really is a thorny thing. It's been discussed at many levels. And every time our current chairman of the board, Greg Wetterston, says, well, Kimball, what if we tried this? My response is always, well, that is subject to negotiation, and the negotiation is where the problem is.
So now, we are incredibly lucky to have volunteers that make our club what it is. The facility is good, but it only is here because we members keep contributing our time, energy, and dues, etc. You're the historian. How much time do you think you spend a week serving our club? How many hours? Can you admit this in front of Lourdes?
Probably not. So purely as a historian, the hours don't collect very much. But when incoming Commodore Ken Glidewell in 2020 decided that he wanted a new curator, I had been doing the job for 2 years, he asked me who I thought should be curator. I said, well, Bob and Elt. Bob accepted on the condition that I would be his boots on the ground. Bob's not getting around at a fast pace these days. I live 12 minutes away. So I find myself in this big old barn, wandering around, looking at walls, reimagining how walls could be used, updating trophies. I have about 15 trophies that the facilities manager and I are going to take a look at this afternoon. Ron, I'd say that 20 or 25 hours in a week is not unusual, and a lot of that is on a Monday or Tuesday when the club is essentially closed.
What are your most frequently used resources for learning about the history of the club?
Well, the book that I wrote, because I don't remember everything that's in it. Old main sheets, tremendous resource. And when I was working on the 75 yearbook, the blessed thing that happened, it was double. I mentioned before the stenographer's record of the 1926 meeting of the San Francisco Yacht Club in which they debated the merits, pro and con, city versus Marilen. That was a gold mine because I didn't have to write out my opinion about what had happened. I simply quoted extensively from the stenographer's record and let the players speak for themselves. That was an absolute godsend. Thank you, Denny. Thank you, Jill Jordan. Approaching the 50th anniversary, there was a plan to do a 50-year book, logically enough. And the leaders of the club, many of them, James Michael for one, did interviews of the people who were then the old guys. Founders, people who knew the founders. Leon DeFremery, Mr. Fernandez. And all of that was recorded, and all of that we still have. Tremendous resource. There are things I learned from that I couldn't possibly know any other way. There was never a 50-year book because the joint burned down, and people were kind of sort of distracted. Books became less important, but all that preparation for the book went into the 75-year book.
So now you've chaired several committees, including, people might not remember, but Kimball, when I took my first sabbatical from being the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon chair, I asked a person I knew could handle it, Kimball Livingston, to be the chair. Do you regret like crazy that you were ever the chairman of the Wednesday? Because you know this is a little bit of work.
It is. It's a very satisfying thing, though. You meet fascinating people, and you become a predator. If something moves in the bushes, you shoot first and then see what you got. Trying to do a program a week, yes.
Well said, exactly. Yes. So Artie Russo, I used to hear about Artie all the time, not just from Nick, his grandnephew, but from Denny. When I sailed with Denny and Al-Wahini and other boats, he'd say, Artie Russo this, Artie Russo that. Give our audience today a sense about what an incredible yachtsman Artie was.
I'd mentioned before he owned 6 boats at one time, 36 feet to 92 feet. He was very big in the R class, the Lady Gay and the Ace. We have the model of the Ace in the manager's office. I thought about bringing that thing out too. I said, oh, come on, this is getting to be a bit much. But all these things that we have under this roof have stories to tell. The models tell our story as a club. The trophies have resonance to our story as a club. And Russo was a builder. He and his brother Oliver built about 200 houses in the Sunset District. They were not the biggest builders of the Sunset. But if you go out there and you see what I would call a storybook house, or maybe something a little bit Disney-esque, that's probably a Russo construction. Both of the brothers had messy public divorces. In Oliver's case, I read in the paper of the day that one of the charges against him was that he often disappeared for yachting parties. And it's noted when Denny got divorced that he was able to keep 2 of his yachts. Did I say Denny? I meant Arthur.
Artie. So you wrote for the Chronicle for a dozen years, the yachting column for the Chronicle. Talk to us about keeping a deadline on an esoteric sport, yachting, week after week after week.
Well, I was basically in competition with Barry Bonds' underwear. The beauty of the job, however, was that on the day I reported to work for the first time, the sports editor told me, well, we're a little bit crowded in here, so we would appreciate it if you would do your work somewhere else. We reached an immediate rapport. And I did all my work somewhere else. Those were the early days of electronics, and for a few years I had to go in to type into a computer system. We weren't transmitting. Although, let's see, 1987 was the big America's Cup year in Perth, Australia. And I was down there with a thing called a Tandy. And I could dial up San Francisco and take a telephone. Remember a telephone? It has a piece here and a piece here. You talk into one, you hear in the other. There were earpieces attached by wire to the Tandy. After I've typed it in, put that in, and it would go talking to the thing at the other end, and my story would magically appear in the paper here. That was 87, so that was the beginning of things for me.
So it's fun for me to keep asking questions, but we have some questions. Do we have any questions for the audience? If you do, Daru will bring, Mark has a question. Great, Mark Darcy, fresh from sailing everywhere. He helped bring up our new powerboat from San Diego. Good to have you here, Mark. Stand up, please.
Oh, thanks. Just got back from the Fastnet as well, so that was a treat.
How were the needles?
The needles were sporty, as they say.
For those of you who don't know, this year's Faznet was a bell ringer.
You ain't kidding. Quick question, and that is through the years, was curious to know if you could share a little bit about any sort of royalty that may have come and visited the club, either the Britannia coming through the Golden Gate or something along those lines.
British royalty did not come here on that occasion of the visit by Britannia, but we've had through the years quite a bit of royalty, most of it in the form of Scandinavian royalty, crown princes, kings, and so forth. To my right over there is something sent to us by, I think it was the King of Norway. And there's a story that's often told about, I believe it was the King of Norway being here in the Blackwater years, and they decided to take him sailing. And of course, there was a security detail, and one of the security people asked Tom, what if the boat sinks? Well, if the boat sinks, there'll be 6 guys in the water yelling, "I'm the king! I'm the king!"
Any other questions from the audience? So, Kimball, talk to us about the fire.
As unlucky as we were lucky. It was the Christmas party of 1976, and the party was gathered upstairs and had finished dinner and was coming downstairs, had come downstairs for the dance. When the Christmas tree, which was right by the main stairway, went up like a candle, and a lot of the club rapidly went with it. If that had happened half an hour before, with a couple hundred people in the main dining room, it would have been international news. As it was, there were 3 people who died. There was an elderly couple visiting from England, and our Commodore Al Simpson, who had a habit of drinking heavily and sleeping it off in a cloakroom upstairs. This was known. One of the waiters tried very hard to get Al out, but he was about 3 times the size of the guy, and eventually, he just had to go. So most of the club burned. What didn't burn in 76 was the other wing over there, which was at the time a sail drying loft, the squash court, storage facilities, spars, what have you. That fell down in 89. For the next couple of years, now we had to rebuild in a hurry. That was because of our lease. We were limited to the perimeter of what we had had before, and there were many constraints of speed and of style and of budget because we were underinsured. But we ran races off a platform here, just the concrete pad that was formed that's under us now. Guys would get out here, raise flags and fire shotguns and get races off during that time period. It happened all again rather quickly. It had to. And it occurs to me that my road to leadership in the club began at the opening Tuesday Yachtsman's lunch when the lectern was over there on what is a different wall. And George Fryermuth, who was running things at the time, asked me to speak for the young farts. And I got up and said, I want to be very clear, I am speaking for the young farts. But having once been in front of the audience here, it sort of became a habit, and you notice I'm still here.
Talk to us about the earthquake.
89, the street outside us fell away. The building behind us mostly fell down, or it didn't all crumble, but it wasn't a building anymore. And Chef kept serving meals. He served outside. I remember him coming down to a lunch with, in the 75 yearbook, I pretended I remembered what it was. I don't actually. but it was a rather fine French wine, which he said, I believe this wine was probably damaged in all the shaking. Why don't we open it and see? So the club carried on.
So back in the 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, there was an active Sea Scout program in Aquatic Park. And Denny Jordan, during his reign as Commodore here, he was also the unofficial Commodore, and he would come down there and get sailors from there. That's where Tom Conroy came from, Kevin O'Connell, I came from there, and Bobby Hinault was a Sea Scout as well. But I always wondered, where was the actual junior sailing program, not stealing guys from the Sea Scouts? When did that start at our yacht club?
That's the mystery that I intend to solve. Where I came in was during my years as a flag officer, feeling, okay, this isn't really the answer to your question, but feeling, okay, I have an obligation as a leader of the club to look into every corner of the club. And when I looked at the junior program, I realized it was completely different from anything I remembered or could imagine. Something called high school sailing had come up in the years I wasn't paying attention. And high school sailing was very, I shouldn't say regimented, but it was formulaic. And it was administered from Los Angeles by the people who had invented it and taken it national. The same people who, by the way, are still in charge of high school sailing. And they run at the national level, and they also run it in the Pacific Coast Interscholastic Sailing Association, PISA, which is where we were dealing as a youth program here. We ran high school sailing in the fall. We ran high school sailing in the spring. And just when that clicked into place is the year that I need to find out, but that's about the time that we started hiring coaches. We actually had a junior program. We took over that garage over in the corner of the building and called it a junior room. And what I noticed was that youth sailing had become soccerized. It was in a silo in a corner of the building. We didn't know the kids. The kids didn't know us. And I had a sophomore at University High saying, well, Mom, Dad, yeah, I joined the yacht club, but I'm just a backdoor member. I'm not a real member. That's where I clicked into gear with the junior program, started showing up, saying, kids, we're all one club. Let's do this. Let's do that. I don't think the coaches were all that comfortable when I first showed up. You know, this Commodore stuff, we were fine. But by and by, they realized I was a long-term player, and the kids were enjoying going sailing, which Lourdes and I were doing, taking kids sailing. And they started floating these thought bubbles. Commodore, you know, we could do a lot more for the kids if we could just make some changes. Well, what kind of changes would you like to make? Well, there's too much high school sailing. It eats up the kids' time. It eats up our time. We could do so much more if we didn't have to do all this high school sailing. I took it over to Belvedere, talked to them, same story. Richmond, same story. But we can't fix it. Why? Well, they won't let us. Who? The people in Southern California. So I called a meeting. I called another meeting, and we wrote a demand letter, and we got some changes, and that set us on the road to where we are now, where we do not run high school sailing in the spring. We do a lot of other things. We're open to all kinds of things. High school sailing is just FJs, white sails only. There's so much more to our sport than just what high school sailing has to offer. It has value. It's co-ed. It's a great thing in and of itself, but breaking out of the constraints was a big deal.
Author, staff Commodore, and thankfully our historian. Thank you, Kimball Livingston, for sharing your thoughts with the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon. Good on you, mate.
Oh, yeah. Lourdes Livingston is reminding me of something.
I'm just reminding him of something.
Yeah. 1967. One of the icons of the club came to us. Richard Ream, you heard that name before. The Ream Trophy, Morning Star. Richard Ream was in charge of the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. We had the Big Boat Series going, the St. Francis Yacht Club Perpetual Trophy Series, and there was a demand for another division, something that was suitable for smaller boats. So we wanted a City of San Francisco trophy. What do we do? Talk to Richard Ream. He says, well, just go on over to the DeYoung and walk around and pick something out. Now, of course, you're not going to walk out with a Picasso and call that the City of San Francisco trophy. They did come up with what is called the Golden Spade. It was used by the mayor to break ground for the Golden Gate Bridge. This was in 1933. A few years ago, while I was in my first term as curator, I got a demand note from the DeYoung Museum. We want it back. Oh, that's inconvenient. But their reasoning was sound. That is, that this shovel was not fine art. But Kimball, give it back to us. We will accession it, and then we will de-accession it to the city archives, and you can deal with those folks. That was about 3 years ago. COVID hit, knocked everything sideways. Yesterday, I drove over to the historical collection of the city of San Francisco and met with the city archivist, signed some papers, and came back with the shovel that was used to break ground for the Golden Gate Bridge. We have a mounting case for it that is out for restoration. It will be on the wall in the starting line room by the Big Boat Series this year. Okay, I'm through for the day. I'll see you around.
This has been a presentation of the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.